The final spiritual awakening does not improve your old life. It sets fire to everything that is false. If you fear the divine fire, it is because you know something within you must be cast away. The final spiritual awakening is the divine fire that will destroy everything in you that is not real, and if your soul is not ready for that ending, you will feel the urge to turn away now. You say you want to awaken, yet you continue living anesthetized, distracted, diminished, repeating patterns you already know imprison you, and this suffocates your soul every single day. Rumi taught that the love of God is a fire that transforms, not one that comforts, and if you keep postponing this final awakening, you will remain trapped in the same limited version of yourself. The cost of staying asleep is losing your own essence. There is only one path, to consciously pass through the divine fire that brings your false self to an end. If you go all the way, you will understand how to endure this fire and enter the true final spiritual awakening. The final spiritual awakening is not a beautiful concept. It is a point of no return. It is when your soul can no longer tolerate living in falsehood. It is when you realize that everything you built may be nothing more than a defense against the void you are afraid to face. This is the beginning of the divine fire. It is not gentle. It is not comfortable. It is confrontational. Do you feel something within you asking for rupture? That is the call of the final awakening. It is not intellectual curiosity. It is the urgency of the soul. In Sufism, the path is to die before you die. To die to the ego, to the persona, to the fragile identity that must be validated at every moment. The final spiritual awakening is precisely this inner death. The ego is the voice that wants to control everything. It is the part that wants to appear strong, right, admired. The divine fire strikes exactly this structure. It does not burn your essence. It burns what prevents you from living your essence. The final awakening is when you accept this burning. You want light, but you do not want to lose control. You want to awaken, but you want to keep your masks. That is impossible. The final spiritual awakening demands total surrender, not partial. Total. It is the moment when you choose truth over your image. Rumi wrote, "The wound is the place where the light enters you." The final awakening passes through your deepest wound, that pain you avoid, that memory you refuse to revisit, that sense of inadequacy you try to hide. The divine fire does not go around it, it goes through it. To awaken spiritually in a final way means to stop fleeing the pain that shapes you. It means looking at your shadow, your envy, your pride, your neediness, and not turning away. In Sufism, this is the purification of the heart. To purify means to remove what covers. The final awakening removes everything that veils your soul. You do not need more information, you need decision. The final spiritual awakening begins when you say, "I no longer want to live halfway. I no longer want to pretend. I no longer want to sustain an identity that is not true." The divine fire does not come to improve your old life. It comes to end it inwardly. It comes to burn the false security you call stability. It comes to free your soul from the invisible prison you learned to call normality. The final spiritual awakening is losing the fear of loss, losing status, losing approval, losing control. Each of these losses opens space for something greater, a silent, steady presence that does not depend on the external world. This is union with God. Union is not theory. It is the inner experience of the dissolution of the false self. In Sufism, this process is called fana, which means annihilation of the ego. It is not physical self-destruction. It is the death of the false center you created to survive. The final spiritual awakening is to pass through fana and allow only what is true to remain. Are you afraid of this ending? That fear reveals exactly where the fire must touch. The final awakening does not destroy your soul. It frees your soul from what suffocates it. It does not diminish you. It reveals you. The question is not whether the divine fire will touch you. The question is whether you will continue resisting or whether you will consciously pass through it. Because once the final spiritual awakening begins, you can no longer pretend you did not hear the call. And perhaps that is exactly what is happening inside you right now. The final spiritual awakening is not a beautiful phase for posting inspirational quotes. It is an inner collapse you can no longer avoid. It is when the life you built begins to feel too small for the truth pulsing within your chest and you try to distract yourself, try to rationalize, try to postpone it, but something has already been ignited, and that something is the divine fire calling you to cross the point of no return. Rumi did not speak of a superficial awakening. He spoke of being consumed by the love that is God, and that love does not caress the ego, it dismantles it piece by piece until only what is real remains. And that is exactly what is happening when you feel you can no longer live as you once did. The final spiritual awakening begins when the things that once gave you pleasure start to lose their shine, when praise no longer sustains your identity, when distractions can no longer silence the void, and you realize you are at war with a life that no longer matches your soul. And that war is not external, it is internal. It is the ego trying to survive while the divine fire advances silently, burning illusions. This discomfort is not failure. It is a sign that the final awakening is pressing you to be born again. You try to maintain control, but the final spiritual awakening does not negotiate with control. It demands total surrender. It demands that you release the need to appear strong. It demands that you face the truth about who you are without emotional cosmetics. And that hurts because it dismantles the image you spent years defending. Yet it is precisely this image that must fall so the soul can breathe freely. The divine fire does not come to destroy you, it comes to destroy what is not you. Rumi taught that the heart must be polished like a mirror to reflect the light, and the final spiritual awakening is exactly this intense polishing, this friction that removes the accumulated rust of pride, fear, and attachment. You feel the friction as crisis, as loss, as confusion, but in truth it is purification. It is the divine fire cleansing the heart so that the presence of God becomes a living experience and not merely a distant idea. The final spiritual awakening confronts your greatest illusion that you are separate from God, separate from the source, separate from love. As long as this illusion remains, you live in constant tension, trying to prove your worth, trying to protect yourself, trying to guarantee security. But when the divine fire touches this sense of separation, it reveals that your fear-based identity was never solid. And that revelation is so powerful it feels as though everything is collapsing. Yet what is collapsing is the lie. Do you fear losing everything? That fear is resistance to the final awakening because the ego believes it will truly die. But what dies is only the false centrality. The persona that needed to be admired, the self that had to control every detail in order to feel safe. And when that self begins to fall, the soul finally finds space to live without the prison of appearances. And that is liberating in a way words can barely explain. The final spiritual awakening is a solitary crossing because no one can pass through the divine fire for you. No one can feel your surrender in your place. No one can hand over your ego for you. That is why few reach the end. Many stop halfway when the burning becomes too intense, when they realize it is not merely a change in behavior but a change in identity. And they retreat. But your soul no longer accepts retreat. In Sufism, the annihilation of the ego, called fana, is the doorway to abiding only in God. The final spiritual awakening is this conscious annihilation. It is you allowing the false center of your life to dissolve so that the true center, the divine presence, may take its place. And this is not distant mystical theory. It is a real experience of transformation that changes the way you love, work, speak, and live. You begin to realize that the final spiritual awakening is not about acquiring something new, but about losing what was always a burden, losing resentments, losing comparisons, losing the need to compete, losing the fear of not being enough. And each loss hurts because the ego clings, yet each loss also releases a lightness you have never known, as if you were finally breathing fresh air after years trapped in a closed room. The divine fire persists because your soul persists. The more you try to return to your old life, the more uncomfortable it becomes because the final spiritual awakening creates an inner point of no return. You can no longer pretend ignorance. You can no longer live fully unconscious. Something within you has already seen the truth, and once truth is seen, it cannot be unseen. It can only be crossed. Rumi wrote, "Die before you die," and this phrase echoes as a direct call to the final spiritual awakening. To die before you die is to allow the ego to dissolve while you are still alive, to experience the divine fire now instead of waiting for life to force that surrender through more painful external losses. And when you understand this, you realize that awakening is not punishment, it is mercy. The final spiritual awakening transforms your relationship with fear, because you begin to see fear as a sign of where the fire must act. Whenever something threatens your image, your security, or your control, there is attachment. And where there is attachment, there is flammable material for the divine fire to work upon. You learn not to flee that heat, but to remain present within it until something false is consumed. You begin to feel a silent presence growing within you, a calm that does not depend on external circumstances, a stability that does not require approval. This is the direct fruit of the final spiritual awakening because when the ego loses strength, the soul gains space and the presence of God ceases to be a distant concept and becomes a real sensation of inner unity. The final spiritual awakening also confronts your relationships because you can no longer sustain bonds based solely on neediness or fear of being alone. The divine fire burns emotional dependencies and reveals where you were leaning on others to fill what only God could fill. And that revelation hurts, yet it also frees you because you begin to love without desperate need. You realize that the final spiritual awakening is not an isolated event, but a continuous process of purification. Each layer of ego that falls reveals another, deeper layer. And the divine fire continues its work, not to destroy you, but to reveal who you have always been behind the accumulated masks. And this revelation is so intense that it completely reshapes your perception of yourself. There are moments when you feel empty, when old reference points are gone, when you no longer know who you are, Mawasan, And this is part of the final spiritual awakening. It is the interval between the death of the false self and the blossoming of the true one. It is the silence after the burning. And if you have the courage to remain in that silence, you will realize it is not emptiness. It is sacred space being prepared. The final spiritual awakening brings a brutal clarity. You begin to see where you were deceiving yourself, where you were sabotaging yourself, where you were living automatically. And this clarity can be uncomfortable because it exposes inconsistencies, yet it is precisely this exposure that allows for real change. Not superficial, not temporary, but structural. You understand that the divine fire is not an enemy. It is an ally. It is the force that pushes you out of spiritual mediocrity, that refuses to allow you to remain anesthetized forever. And even when it hurts, there is a strange sense of relief, as if what needed to happen for a long time is finally happening. The final spiritual awakening transforms your vision of success because you stop measuring value solely by external achievements and begin measuring it by inner truth, by the coherence between what you feel and how you live. And this shift of reference is profound because it completely redefines your priorities. And the more you surrender to the divine fire, the more you realize that the true final spiritual awakening is not about becoming someone special, but about becoming transparent so that the presence of God may act through you. And when this begins to happen, you feel that something far greater is guiding your life. And the question that remains burning within you is, how far are you willing to go in this surrender? The final spiritual awakening does not stop when you understand the concept. It truly begins when you feel you can no longer turn back, when you realize the old way of thinking no longer fits, that the old justifications sound hollow. And this creates an almost unbearable tension because you are between two worlds, the old one that is dying and the new one that has not yet fully been born. It is precisely in this interval that the divine fire works most intensely, pressing you to choose once and for all truth instead of illusion. You begin to notice that your reactions change, that what once irritated you now reveals something about yourself, that every external conflict is a mirror of what still needs to be purified within. The final spiritual awakening transforms your entire life into a field of awareness. Nothing is random anymore. Nothing is mere coincidence. Everything becomes an opportunity for burning, for cleansing, for liberation from what has not yet been surrendered to the divine fire. Rumi spoke of love as a force that dismantles the lover so that he becomes love itself, and the final spiritual awakening is exactly that. It is not merely feeling something elevated, it is being dismantled until what remains is pure presence, without masks, without games, without constant defense. And this is radical because it requires you to abandon the identity you fought so hard to sustain, yet which never brought true peace. You realize that the final spiritual awakening is not comfortable because comfort keeps the ego intact. The divine fire is not interested in keeping the ego comfortable, it is interested in revealing the soul. And when the soul begins to emerge, there is an intense sense of vulnerability, as if you were exposed without protection. Yet this vulnerability is strength. It is authenticity being born where fear once lived. The final spiritual awakening also changes your relationship with time. You stop living merely waiting for something in the future and begin to experience the present moment as sacred space because you understand that the divine fire acts right now. Not tomorrow, not when everything is perfect, but here, while you breathe, while you feel, while you choose, between reacting out of fear or acting from truth. You begin to see that each time you choose truth over appearance, the final spiritual awakening deepens. Each time you admit a mistake without defending yourself, each time you release an old resentment, each time you decide not to feed a comparison, something within you aligns. And this alignment is a sign that the divine fire is consuming yet another layer of the false self. The final spiritual awakening requires repeated courage, not a single dramatic decision, but small daily surrenders, small acts of honesty, small moments of silence in which you listen to the soul instead of the noise of the ego. It is in this constancy that the fire remains lit, not as a chaotic explosion, but as a steady flame that slowly transforms everything it touches. You realize that the closer you move toward the final spiritual awakening, the less you need to prove anything to the world, because the need to prove was sustained by the insecure ego. And when the ego begins to dissolve, a quiet confidence arises, not arrogant, but grounded, an inner certainty that you are being guided by something greater than your own strategies of control. The divine fire reveals where you are still attached to roles, labels, old stories about who you are. The final spiritual awakening invites you to release those labels, to allow your identity to be defined by the presence of God rather than by past experiences. And this is liberating, because you cease to be a prisoner of your own narrative. You begin to feel that the final spiritual awakening is not about escaping the world, but about being in the world with expanded awareness, with a cleansed heart, with pure intention, and this changes the way you work, the way you speak, the way you love. Everything becomes an expression of a soul that has been touched by the divine fire and no longer wishes to live halfway. There are moments when the process feels slow, when you think you are not progressing, but the final spiritual awakening is not measured by intense sensations all the time. It is measured by the gradual reduction of the ego, by the diminishing need for control, by the growing ability to remain at peace even when external circumstances are not ideal. You begin to understand that the divine fire does not burn only grand illusions, but also small habits of dishonesty, subtle manipulations, minor omissions. The final spiritual awakening demands total coherence. It requires that your outer life reflect your inner transformation, because any inconsistency becomes fuel for further purification. Rumi reminded us that what you love shapes you, and the final spiritual awakening redirects your love. You cease to love only validation, security, and power, and begin to love truth above all else. And this love for truth sustains the divine fire even when the burning is uncomfortable. You begin to notice that the final spiritual awakening brings simplicity, not complication. You simplify relationships, simplify choices, simplify priorities. The ego is complex, it constantly creates layers and justifications, but the soul is direct, clear, silent. And the more the fire works, the simpler your life becomes. The divine fire also teaches you to trust. Not in guaranteed outcomes, but in the presence that guides the process. The final spiritual awakening strengthens this trust. You feel that you are not alone in the crossing, that there is a greater intelligence guiding each step, even when you do not fully understand what is happening. You begin to feel that the fear of loss diminishes, because you have already experienced the loss of the false self and survived. The final spiritual awakening shows you that what is true within you cannot be burned, only what is illusory is consumed. And this discovery brings profound freedom. The final spiritual awakening makes you look back and realize how much you were imprisoned by external expectations, how often you shaped your choices to please, to be accepted, to avoid rejection. And when the divine fire dissolves this dependence, you begin to act from inner conviction, not from social pressure. You realize that the process is not linear. There are days of intense clarity and days of doubt. Yet even in doubt, the final spiritual awakening has already left a permanent mark. You can no longer live fully unconscious. Something has been seen. Something has been felt, and that awareness cannot be erased. The divine fire continues working in the most subtle areas, in hidden intentions and invisible motivations. The final spiritual awakening deepens when you begin to examine not only what you do, but why you do it. Not only your actions, but their roots. And this honest inquiry accelerates transformation. And the more you allow the divine fire to complete its work, the more you realize that the true final spiritual awakening is not a distant destination. It is a state of continuous surrender. It is living each day with the heart open to be purified, transformed, and guided. And the question that continues burning within you now is, are you willing to surrender even the last layer that still insists on surviving? You begin to realize that the final spiritual awakening does not ask merely for external changes. It demands a total revision of what you call me, because what you have always defended as your personality may be nothing more than a set of defenses built to survive. And the divine fire comes precisely to pass through those defenses, not with cruel violence, but with an intensity that no longer allows escape. When you feel this pressure, you understand that you are not being punished. You are being called to truly be born. The final spiritual awakening dismantles the false security you built upon the opinions of others, because as long as your identity depends on someone else's gaze, you will never be free. The divine fire burns that dependency. It forces you to face the fear of not being approved, not being understood, not being admired. And, as you pass through that fear, something solid begins to rise within you, a firmness that does not depend on applause. You begin to see that the final spiritual awakening is profoundly intimate. No one can validate your crossing. No one can measure your level of consciousness. And this frustrates the ego that seeks spiritual recognition. But the divine fire also burns the desire to appear awakened, because true awakening requires no stage. It unfolds in the silence of the heart. Rumi spoke of love as an ocean that dissolves the separate self, and the final spiritual awakening is diving into that ocean without knowing how to swim. It is trusting that in losing yourself, you will be found. And this trust is tested each time life takes from you something that upheld your identity. Each time an old certainty collapses, each time a comfortable illusion is exposed as a lie. The final spiritual awakening also transforms the way you respond to pain. Before you fought against it, blamed the world, withdrew, now you begin to ask, what is this purifying in me? And that question changes everything, because it turns suffering into a portal, transforms crisis into an opportunity for conscious burning in the divine fire. You begin to feel that the final spiritual awakening creates a healthy distance between you and your thoughts. You realize you are not every thought that arises, that many of them are merely echoes of the ego trying to survive. And when you no longer automatically identify with those thoughts, the divine fire gains space to act more deeply. There are moments when the final spiritual awakening feels like loneliness, because you no longer fully fit into superficial conversations, empty competition, struggles for status, and that feeling can be frightening. Yet it is a sign that your soul is seeking depth, refusing to live only on the surface. The divine fire is opening space for more authentic connections. The final spiritual awakening also confronts your relationship with power. You begin to see where you used control to feel safe, where you manipulated situations to avoid vulnerability. The divine fire reveals these hidden strategies, not to humiliate you, but to free you from them. For as long as you need to control everything, you are still bound by fear. You begin to notice that the final spiritual awakening brings an almost brutal honesty. You can no longer lie to yourself so easily. You can no longer justify inconsistent behavior because something within you is attentive, vigilant, illuminated, and this vigilance is the direct fruit of the purification of the heart. Rumi taught that the heart must be emptied in order to be filled, and the final spiritual awakening is this continuous emptying. It is releasing rigid beliefs, letting go of old narratives of victim or hero, allowing the divine fire to create space where there was once an accumulation of resentments and expectations. You begin to perceive that the final spiritual awakening is not only internal, it reflects in your posture, in your gaze, in the way you listen to someone. There is more presence, less haste, less need to interrupt, because the ego that needed to assert itself is slowly dissolving. The divine fire also touches your ambitions, not to destroy them, but to purify them. You begin to ask yourself whether you seek success to serve or merely to feed your image. And that question reveals much, because the final spiritual awakening redefines your deepest motivations. You feel that life begins to seem simpler and at the same time more intense. Each moment carries meaning, each choice has weight. And the final spiritual awakening makes you realize that there is no neutrality. Either you act from the ego or you act from the soul. This constant awareness keeps the fire alive. There are days when you feel weary of the process, tempted to return to the old comfortable ignorance. But the final spiritual awakening has already planted an irreversible seed. You can no longer pretend you do not know. You can no longer live fully unconscious. Something has been seen, and it cannot be unseen. The divine fire teaches you to endure the discomfort of transformation, to remain present when the ego cries out for control, to breathe when the old identity tries to reassert itself. And each time you remain conscious instead of reacting automatically, the final spiritual awakening deepens another level. You begin to understand that true strength is not imposing yourself upon others, but mastering your own reactions, your own defensive tendencies. The final spiritual awakening strengthens precisely this capacity, this inner freedom to choose not to act from egoic impulse. The final spiritual awakening also transforms your relationship with God. God ceases to be a distant idea or merely a cultural belief and becomes a living presence, felt in silence, perceived in expanded awareness. And the more the divine fire purifies, the clearer this presence becomes. You understand that the process is not about becoming perfect, but about becoming true, aligning thought, word, and action. The final spiritual awakening insists upon this coherence because any inner division is a sign that there is still material for the fire to consume. The divine fire continues revealing subtle layers, hidden expectations, fears you did not even know you carried. The final spiritual awakening does not allow anything false to remain concealed forever. Everything unreal eventually comes to light to be transformed, and as you move through all of this, the question that remains alive, burning like an ember within your chest, is how far you are willing to allow the divine fire to go, how far you are willing to be purified, how far you accept that the final spiritual awakening is not merely an event, but the complete redefinition of your existence. You begin to realize that the final spiritual awakening is not interested in improving your spiritual image. It is interested in destroying any image that replaces the truth. As long as you try to appear evolved, you remain trapped in a persona. And the divine fire does not accept personas. It accepts only raw authenticity, without makeup, without rehearsed speeches. And this deeply confronts your need to be seen as someone special. The final spiritual awakening exposes the difference between speaking about light and living the light. Speaking is comfortable, but living it requires burning everything that contradicts that light. The divine fire reveals every inconsistency, every small inner lie, every attitude that does not align with what you claim to believe. And that exposure hurts, yet it also purifies. You begin to feel that the final spiritual awakening changes your perception of identity. You no longer define yourself merely by profession, past, achievements, or traumas. Something deeper starts to emerge. An identity rooted in presence, not in history. And the divine fire slowly dissolves the narratives you once used to justify who you thought you were. There comes a point when the final spiritual awakening becomes inevitable because the awareness you have reached no longer allows you to go backward. You may try to distract yourself, try to return to old habits, but there is a constant restlessness that refuses to let you settle. And that restlessness is the divine fire reminding you that you have been called to something greater. The final spiritual awakening also confronts your need for absolute security. As long as you demand guarantees before surrendering, you are still controlling the process. The divine fire asks for trust without guarantees. It asks for real faith, not merely words. It asks you to move forward even without knowing every detail of the path. You begin to realize that the final spiritual awakening redefines success. You no longer measure your life solely by external results, but by the quality of your consciousness, by the sincerity of your heart, and this completely shifts your priorities because the divine fire transforms the interior before any external recognition. The final spiritual awakening teaches you to endure silence, that uncomfortable silence where there are no distractions, where you encounter your own thoughts, your own shadows. It is in this silence that the divine fire works most deeply, revealing hidden layers that would never be seen in constant noise. You begin to see that the final spiritual awakening requires real humility. The closer you move toward truth, the more you realize how much still needs purification. The divine fire dismantles any spiritual pride that tries to settle in, any sense of superiority the ego attempts to adopt as a new identity. The final spiritual awakening transforms your relationship with error. You stop defending yourself automatically and begin learning from each mistake because you understand that every error reveals a part of the ego that still needs to be burned. This open posture accelerates the work of the divine fire within you. You begin to feel that the final spiritual awakening is not about escaping pain, but about passing through it consciously. Each pain faced without avoidance strengthens your soul, and the divine fire uses these experiences to purify your intention, your character, your way of responding to the world. The final spiritual awakening also alters your relationship with comparison. You no longer feel the same need to compete or measure your worth against others because the divine fire dissolves that constant search for validation. In its place arises a quiet security that does not depend on invisible rankings. You begin to understand that the final spiritual awakening demands constancy, not only intense emotional moments, but daily decisions to align with truth. The divine fire remains lit when you repeatedly choose to act from awareness rather than impulse. The final spiritual awakening brings clarity about your hidden motivations. You start to notice when you act out of fear, out of neediness, out of a desire for approval. And this clarity is uncomfortable, yet liberating, because the divine fire can only purify what is honestly seen. You feel that the final spiritual awakening strengthens your ability to stand firm even when you are not understood, because the divine fire creates an inner conviction that does not require constant confirmation from others. That stability is the fruit of the ego's purification. The final spiritual awakening changes your relationship with the past. You stop living trapped in regret or old guilt because you understand that every experience was part of the process that brought you here. And the divine fire transforms even past mistakes into fuel for present awareness. You begin to notice that the final spiritual awakening does not eliminate challenges, but it completely changes your posture toward them. You no longer react automatically with fear or despair, but with presence and attention, and this shift reveals that the divine fire is completing its inner work. The final spiritual awakening also redefines love. You begin to love without the need to possess, without the constant fear of loss, because the divine fire dissolves emotional dependencies and reveals a purer, freer love, one aligned with the presence of God. You start to feel that the final spiritual awakening creates inner unity. Thought, word, and action begin to align, and this coherence generates profound peace, because the divine fire has eliminated inner conflicts that once divided your energy. The final spiritual awakening reveals that true freedom is not doing whatever you want, but being free from the compulsions of the ego, free from the need to prove your worth, free from the obsession with control. And that freedom is the direct result of the continuous action of the divine fire. And as you feel this transformation unfolding layer by layer, the question that continues echoing within you is whether you are truly willing to allow the final spiritual awakening to go all the way, without reservations, without hiding places, without a final defense, allowing the divine fire to fully reveal who you are beyond all illusions. If the divine fire has begun to touch you, do not ignore it. The final spiritual awakening is not entertainment, it is real transformation. If something within your chest is burning right now, it is because your soul has heard the call. Comment, "I accept the fire," if you feel you are ready to pass through this purification. Subscribe now and enable notifications. Here we do not speak of superficial spirituality, we speak of real profound transformation faithful to the teachings of Rumi. Share this video with someone you feel is being called to the final spiritual awakening. And if you want to dive even deeper into the path of authentic Sufism, become a member of the channel and walk with us in this crossing of the divine fire.